My parents first called it a dead-end job on a Sunday evening in September when I had been working in the genetics and genomic analysis division for 3 weeks, and I had come home for dinner because I still came home for dinner in those early months. And my mother had asked how the job was going, and I had told her that I was working through sample verification protocols and learning the data chain management system. And my father had looked at my mother across the table, and my mother had looked at my father, and then my father had looked at me and said that he hoped I understood that laboratory administration was not a career and was a waiting room, and that the people who stayed in waiting rooms were people who had not decided where they actually wanted to go. And I said that I understood, and I passed the bread, and I did not say anything further. And that was the first time Clara had started her medical degree 4 months earlier. I want to tell you about the way my parents talked about Clara's medical degree because I think the contrast matters, and the way they talked about it was the way people talk about something that confirms everything they had always believed about themselves, which is with a specific and expansive pride that requires an audience. And my father told the story of Clara's acceptance at every dinner table that would receive it. And my mother had framed the acceptance letter and put it in the hallway. And when people came to the house, my mother would bring them to the hallway the way you bring people to see a view. And she would stand beside the frame and she would say that this was what dedication looked like. And people would nod and say that they must be so proud. And my mother would say that they were, and she would not look in the direction of the room where I was sitting. I had paid my own tuition. I want to say that plainly because I think it is the kind of plain fact that gets lost in the texture of a family narrative. And the plain fact is that from the age of 18, I had paid every cost associated with my education and my qualification and my living expenses. And I had done this through a combination of part-time work and a scholarship that I had applied for without telling my parents. Because telling them would have required explaining what I was applying to study, and explaining what I was applying to study would have produced a version of the Sunday evening conversation at a volume and duration that I was not willing to manage, and so I had not told them, and I had applied, and I had been awarded the scholarship, and I had qualified, and I had been hired, and I had been sitting at a desk in the genetics and genomic analysis division for 8 years, and my parents had been calling it a dead-end job for 8 years, and I had been listening to them call it that for 8 years, and I had been doing the work. The work is what I want to tell you about because I think people underestimate what the work actually is, and what it is this, which is the systematic and precise analysis of biological information that has been entrusted to a laboratory by people who need to know the truth about something fundamental. And my specific role in the division was the verification and cross-referencing of genetic sample results against registered family profiles. And the work required a quality of attention that I had found from the beginning suited me completely, which is the attention of a person who understands that accuracy is not a preference and is an obligation, and that the obligation does not have exceptions and does not have bad days. And I had given it that quality of attention for 8 years at a desk in a building my parents had never visited. And I had found in those 8 years that the work was the most honest thing in my life. Which is to say that it told the truth regardless of who was listening and regardless of what the truth cost. And I had found that quality rare enough to be worth protecting. The Tuesday morning in February was ordinary in the way that significant mornings always are ordinary before they become significant. And I arrived at my desk at 8:40. And I made the tea. I made every morning. And I opened the digital queue. And the queue contained 11 files. And I worked through them in order the way I always worked through them, which is from the top without skipping and without reading ahead. Because reading ahead introduces anticipation. And anticipation is a variable that does not belong in verification work. And I worked through the first 4 files, and they were standard, and I noted the results, and I cross-referenced the profiles, and I logged the confirmations, and I moved to the 5th file. The 5th file had a standard priority flag. I want to tell you that there was nothing about the flag that indicated what the file contained, and there was nothing about the way it appeared in the queue that was different from the 4 files I had already processed, and I opened it the way I opened everything, which is with the full and undivided attention of a person who has decided that every file deserves the same quality of reading, regardless of what it appears to be on the surface. I read the sample identification data. I read the registered profile data. I read the match analysis, and then I read it again. The system had flagged a familial profile discrepancy, which is a specific category of flag that appears when a submitted sample produces a genetic match result that is inconsistent with the registered family relationship data attached to the profiles in question, and the discrepancy in this file was not a marginal statistical variation and was an absolute and unambiguous absence of shared paternal DNA between 2 profiles that were registered in the system as full biological siblings. The 2 profiles were registered under surnames. I knew. I sat in my chair, and I looked at the screen. The system had run its automatic secondary matching protocol, which is the process by which an unmatched paternal profile is cross-referenced against the full registered database to identify the closest biological match available, and the closest biological match available for the paternal DNA of the second profile was not an unknown individual and was not an unregistered person, and was a profile that had been submitted to our laboratory 2 years earlier for a routine executive health screening. And the name attached to that profile was the name of a man who had been eating Sunday dinners in my parents' house since before I was born, and who had given a speech at my parents' 20th anniversary dinner, and whose children I had grown up alongside without ever understanding why my mother always seemed to arrange the seating so that he and Clara were at the same end of the table. I looked at the screen. The laboratory was quiet around me, and the data chain was doing what it always did, which was telling the truth, regardless of who was listening. And I sat in the dead-end job that my parents had mocked for 8 years, and I looked at the scientific proof of the reason they had mocked it. And I understood that the 26 years of being the lesser daughter had not been simple favoritism, and had been the daily maintenance of a secret that had required someone to be smaller so that something else could stay hidden. And I had been that someone, and the hiding was over. I did not move for a long time. I looked at the screen. I picked up my pen. I began the verification protocol from the beginning. I want to tell you about the 3 weeks that followed the Tuesday morning, because I think the quality of those 3 weeks is the most important part of what I am going to tell you. And the quality was this, which was the quality of absolute methodical silence. And I mean silence in the specific sense of a person who has received information of enormous personal significance and has chosen to process it through the only framework she trusts, which is the framework of evidence and verification and the complete absence of action until the evidence has been tested to the limit of what the available tools can do to it. I ran the secondary verification on the Wednesday morning. The secondary verification is a parallel processing protocol that takes the original sample data and reprocesses it through a different algorithmic pathway to confirm that the result produced by the primary analysis is not an artifact of the specific computational route the first analysis took, and it takes between 24 and 48 hours, depending on the complexity of the profile data. And I submitted it on Wednesday morning at 9:14. And I went back to my regular queue, and I processed the other files in the queue with the same quality of attention I gave them every day, because the other files contained other people's truths. and other people's truths did not stop requiring accurate handling, because mine had just arrived in an unexpected form. I want to tell you about something I remembered while the secondary verification was processing. I was 12 years old, and it was Christmas, and the family friend whose name I will not use here, but who I will call by the initial R, had come to our house for Christmas dinner, as he did every year. And he had brought gifts, and his gifts for Clara were always different in kind from his gifts for me. And I had understood this as a child, in the way that children understand financial differences between adults, which is imperfectly and without the full framework that would make the understanding complete. And what R had brought Clara, that Christmas was a promise, which was that he was going to arrange piano lessons for her at the conservatoire in the city, and that he had already spoken to the teacher, and that the lessons would begin in January, and Clara had looked at my mother when he said it, and my mother had looked at R. And the look between them had lasted half a second longer than the look between two people receiving generous news from a friend. And I had noticed the length of it, and had filed it in the place where I filed things that did not yet have a category, and I had not thought about it again for 22 years, until I was sitting at a desk, waiting for a secondary verification to process. I thought about the piano. I thought about the car that R had given Clara on her 18th birthday, which my parents had described as an extraordinarily generous gift from a man who had always had a soft spot for Clara. And I thought about the soft spot, and I thought about what a soft spot actually is when it persists across 18 years and expresses itself in the specific and consistent pattern of giving one child everything and the other child nothing. And I thought about how my parents had normalized each instance of this imbalance separately, so that no single instance was large enough to require an explanation. And I thought about what it means to normalize something separately and repeatedly over 18 years. And what it means is that the normalization is not casual and is deliberate, and has been maintained with the same consistency that my work required me to apply to data verification. And I thought that my mother had been doing a form of data management for my entire life, and the data she had been managing was me. The secondary verification completed on the Thursday evening. At 6:42, I was still at my desk because I had stayed, and the result was identical to the primary analysis result in every data point, and the system logged the confirmation, and the screen showed the result in the clean, unambiguous green of a verified finding. And I looked at the green for a long time. I submitted the tertiary verification on the Friday morning. The tertiary verification is not a standard part of the protocol, and is an additional step that I added because I needed to be certain in a way that went beyond what the standard protocol required, and it uses a third algorithmic pathway and cross-references the result against the National Genetic Database rather than just the laboratory's internal registered profiles, and it takes longer than the secondary verification. And I submitted it on Friday morning, and I went home for the weekend. And I want to tell you about those 2 days, because they were 2 days of ordinary life conducted inside the knowledge of an extraordinary thing. And I cleaned my flat, and I went to the market on Saturday morning, and I read in the evening, and I did not call my parents, and I did not call Clara, and I did not call anyone, and I sat with what I knew the way you sit with something that is too large to be processed quickly. And I let the weekend be what it was, which was 2 days of ordinary life. That would be the last 2 days before the tertiary verification completed. It completed on the Tuesday morning of the third week. I arrived at my desk at 8:40, and the result was waiting in my secure results folder. And I opened it, and the result was green in every data point, and the system had additionally returned the National Database cross-reference, which confirmed the biological paternal match to R's profile with a statistical confidence rating that the laboratory's own documentation described as conclusive, which was the word the documentation used for results where the margin for alternative interpretation was zero. There was no error. I want to say that plainly because I think it needs to be said plainly and without qualification. And the plain statement is this, which is that the genetic evidence was conclusive and verified through 3 independent analytical pathways and cross-referenced against the national database. And the result was the same each time. And the result was that my mother had been conducting a deception for the entirety of Clara's life, and my father had been living inside that deception without knowing it. And R had been eating Christmas dinner at our house every year, and giving Clara a piano and a car, and arranging her music lessons. And my parents had called my laboratory work a dead-end job for 8 years. And the dead-end job had just produced the most precise and comprehensive evidence of their lives' central lie that any instrument available to them could have produced. I did not pick up my phone. I did not compose a message. I opened the laboratory's formal case management system, and I created a new case file, and I uploaded the primary and secondary and tertiary verification results. And I attached the national database cross-reference, and I completed the mandatory fields in the disclosure preparation form, which is the form that the laboratory's corporate protocol requires to be completed when a familial profile mismatch of this category has been verified. And the form, when completed, initiates the automated disclosure process, which is the institutional process by which the registered profile holders who are affected by a verified mismatch result are formally notified through the laboratory's official medical communication system. I completed every field. I saved the case file into the secure encrypted folder on my desktop. I looked at the folder, I looked out of the laboratory window at the gray February afternoon, and the city was doing what cities do in February, which is existing inside a gray that is patient and indifferent, and entirely without opinion about what is happening inside the buildings. It surrounds. I did not need to do anything else. The institution would do what the institution was built to do. I turned back to my queue. There were 9 files waiting. I opened the first one. The automated disclosure system has a processing timeline that is documented in the laboratory's operational manual, and the timeline is 6 working days from the date of case file submission to the date of certified dispatch. And I knew this timeline the way I knew every protocol in the manual, which is precisely and completely because I had read the manual when I joined the division and had reread the relevant sections when I needed to. And the relevant sections were now very relevant. And the 6 working days began on the Tuesday afternoon when I submitted the case file and completed the disclosure preparation form. And I want to tell you about those 6 days, because I think the quality of them matters. And the quality was the same quality I had described in the 3 weeks of verification, which was methodical and ordinary, and entirely without the performance of what was happening beneath the surface. I arrived at my desk on the Wednesday at 8:40. I processed my queue. I ate lunch at my desk as I usually did on Wednesdays, which was a habit I had developed in the first year and had never seen a reason to change. And I drank my tea at 3, and I completed my end-of-day logging, and I went home, and I made dinner, and I read, and I went to bed at 10:30. And I slept well, and I want to tell you again that I mentioned the sleeping, because it continues to be relevant. And the relevance is that I had made a decision, and the decision was complete. And a complete decision does not require the night hours for its reprocessing. Thursday was the same Friday, was the same on Friday afternoon. My section supervisor stopped at my desk and asked if I had plans for the weekend, and I said that I was going to the market on Saturday morning and that I might go to the gallery in the afternoon. And she said that sounded nice. And I said that it did. and she moved on, and I finished the last file in my queue, and I logged out, and I went home, and I did not think about the disclosure system's processing timeline in the specific way that I would have thought about it if I had been the kind of person who waits anxiously for things, and I am not that kind of person. And I went to the market on Saturday morning, as I had said I would. I was back in my flat at 11:43. On Saturday morning, I had bought the things I needed for the week, and I had put them away, and I had made tea, and I was sitting at the table by the window when the first call came through. And the name on the screen was my mother's name, and I looked at it, and I let it ring out, and I picked up my tea, and I looked at the street below the window, which was doing what streets do on Saturday mornings, which is carrying people who are moving through their ordinary lives without awareness of what is happening in the flats above them. The second call came 4 minutes later. It was my mother. Again, the third call was my father. I want to tell you that the calls came in the sequence I had expected them to come in, which was my mother first, because my mother is the person in the family who responds to a crisis by immediately attempting to reach the person she believes can manage it. And my father second, because my father follows my mother's lead in moments of acute panic, even though he has spent 30 years presenting himself as the person who does not follow anyone's lead. And the fourth call was Clara. And the fourth call surprised me slightly. Not because Clara called and because of how quickly she called, which was within 20 minutes of the first call from my mother, which told me that the envelope had been opened and processed and communicated across the family in a period of time that reflected the severity of what the envelope contained. I looked at the missed calls. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter. I thought about the envelope. The laboratory's certified disclosure envelopes are a specific size and weight, and they are sealed in a way that communicates before they are opened that what is inside them is formal and consequential, and they are sent by tracked delivery and require a signature. And I thought about my mother signing for that envelope, and I thought about the specific sequence of the opening, which would have been my mother, because my mother opens everything that arrives at the house, and then the reading of the cover letter, which would have taken perhaps 2 minutes, because the cover letter is written in the accessible language that the laboratory uses for patient communications. And then the reading of the genetic match report, which is more technical, but which contains a plain language summary at the top of the first page. And the plain language summary would have taken 30 seconds to read, and 30 seconds was enough. I thought about my father. My father's identity as a man of the family had been constructed over 30 years on the foundation of Clara's existence as his daughter, and the specific quality of pride he took in her, and the specific quality of investment he had made in her, and the medical degree and the piano that R had paid for, and the car that R had given her, and 30 years of Christmas dinners, and the framed acceptance letter in the hallway, and the story he told at every table. And I thought about what a man like my father does when the foundation of an identity is removed in a plain language summary at the top of a genetic match report. And I thought that what he does is call his wife, and then call his daughter, and then stand in a hallway beside a framed letter and understand that the frame is the only thing that has not changed. I thought about my mother. I thought about 26 years of daily maintenance. I thought about the seating arrangements at dinner parties and the normalizations of R's gifts and the Sunday evening when she had looked at my father across the table before he called my job a dead end. And I thought about what it costs to maintain something for 26 years, and what it costs when the maintenance ends. Not because you chose to end it, but because a Tuesday morning file queue ended it for you through a process you did not know existed. in a building you had called a dead end for 8 years. I thought about Clara. I thought about a woman who had built her identity on being the chosen one, and who had just received documented evidence that the choosing had a biological explanation that had never been disclosed to her, and that the family she had understood herself to be the center of had a different architecture than the one she had been shown. And I thought about what that does to a person. And I found that I had more capacity for that thought than for the others, which is to say that Clara was the one person in the envelope's distribution list who had not known and had not chosen. And I noted that I noted it. The phone rang again at 2:17. It was my mother. I looked at the name on the screen for a long moment. I picked it up. I said nothing. I listened. My mother's breath on the other end was the breath of a person who has been crying and has not stopped and is now trying to produce words inside the crying, and what came through was not words for the first several seconds, and was simply the sound of a woman who had spent 26 years managing something very carefully and had watched it become unmanageable in the time it takes to sign for a certified envelope. And I held the phone, and I listened, and I waited, and I said nothing. I was very good at saying nothing. I had been practicing it for 26 years. My mother's voice when I answered the call at 2:17 on Saturday afternoon was not a voice I had heard from her before. And I want to be precise about that, because I have heard my mother's voice in many registers across 26 years. And what I heard on Saturday afternoon was different from all of them. And what made it different was not the volume and was not the crying, and was the specific quality of a person who has lost the thing that has been organizing their life and is speaking from inside the first moments of understanding what that loss means. She said my name. She said it several times in the way that people say a name when they need the person attached to it to perform a specific function. And the function she needed was for me to tell her that what was in the envelope was wrong. And she said this explicitly after the name. Saying had not produced an immediate response, and she said that it was a computer error, and that these systems made mistakes, and that genetic databases had been wrong before, and that she had read about cases where laboratory results had been overturned, and that I worked there, and I knew how these things worked, and she needed me to tell her that this was one of those cases, and she said the word, please, and she said it more than once, and her breathing between the pleases was the breathing of a person who has been crying for several hours and has not stopped. I listened to all of it. I let it complete itself the way a piece of equipment completes its cycle before you respond to what it has produced. And when she had finished, I said one sentence, and the sentence was that the laboratory group does not make errors at the tertiary verification level, and that a result carrying a conclusive confidence rating is not subject to reversal on the basis of preference. And then I ended the call. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter. I went back to my tea, which had gone cold, and I made a fresh cup, and I stood at the window, and I looked at the street, and I thought about the word preference, which was the word I had used, and I thought about whether it was the right word, and I decided that it was the most accurate word available, because what my mother was asking for was not a scientific review and was a preferential outcome, and the laboratory did not produce preferential outcomes, and had never produced preferential outcomes, and was not going to begin producing them on a Saturday afternoon, because a woman who had called her daughter's career a dead end for 8 years needed it too. I did not hear from them again on Saturday. Sunday was quiet in the way that Sundays are quiet when the people who would normally fill them with noise are occupied with something that has silenced them. And I went to the gallery as I had planned, and I stood in front of a large canvas for a long time. And I thought about nothing in particular. And I came home, and I made dinner. And I went to bed at 10:30. I arrived at my desk on Monday morning at 8:40. The laboratory group's senior authorization department occupies the upper executive floor of the headquarters building, and I had been asked to work from that floor for the duration of the compliance case management process, and I want to tell you about the view from that floor because I think it is relevant, which is that the floor has a glass frontage overlooking the reception area below. And from my chair at the desk, I had been allocated. I could see the reception desk and the waiting area and the entry doors, and the digital booking confirmation system, which shows the day's scheduled arrivals as a rolling display on a screen beside the reception desk. And I had been sitting at that desk for 40 minutes when the picture of the weekend's events assembled itself through 3 separate channels. The first channel was my section supervisor, who stopped by the desk at 9:15 and said that the genetics division had received a call on Saturday afternoon from a member of the public attempting to dispute a verified disclosure result, and that the call had been handled by the duty officer according to the escalation protocol. And I said that I was aware, and she said that there had been subsequent calls on Saturday evening and Sunday morning, and that the caller had become progressively less measured. And I said that I understood the second channel was the compliance team's internal briefing note, which had been distributed to the senior floor at 8 that morning, and which described the case file status and noted that the registered profile holders had been contacted through the secondary notification protocol, which is the protocol used when the initial disclosure produces a response that the duty team classifies as requiring compliance oversight. And I read the briefing note twice, and I noted that the secondary notification had informed the relevant parties that the result had been flagged for institutional review. The third channel was the picture I assembled from what I knew of my family's weekend without being told it directly, and what I knew was this, which was that Clara had spent Saturday evening attempting to contact R, and that R had not responded in the way Clara had needed him to respond. And I knew this because R's response to a situation of this kind was entirely predictable to anyone who understood what R had built over 30 years, which was a marriage and a professional reputation and a social position, and all 3 of those things were incompatible with acknowledging the contents of a genetics disclosure envelope. And Clara had discovered this incompatibility on Saturday evening, and had called her mother, and she called Mom. Mom called the clinic on Sunday morning at 9:47, according to the call log that the duty officer had included in the compliance briefing. And what my mother had said on that call was that she needed to speak to whoever was in charge of the genetics division, and that she was a medical family, and that her daughter's medical career was at stake, and that the file needed to be locked, and that if it was not locked, she would pursue legal action against the laboratory group. And the duty officer had listened to all of this and had followed the protocol that the compliance team had prearranged for calls of this category, which was to inform the caller that results of this verification level required senior authorization review, and that the registered profile holders were required to attend an in-person compliance meeting at the main headquarters building. My mother had asked when the duty officer had said. The following morning at 9, my mother had said that she would need to bring her daughter, and the duty officer had said that all registered profile holders connected to the case file were required to attend, and my mother had said that her husband would also need to be present, and the duty officer had said that would be appropriate. There had then been a second call at 11 on Sunday morning from a different number, and the number belonged to Clara. And Clara had asked to speak to the chief compliance officer, and she had been transferred, and the chief compliance officer on duty was Dr. Anita Ferreira, who had been briefed on the case file and who I had spoken to on Friday afternoon before I left the building, and Dr. Anita Ferreira had the quality of a person who has been managing institutional compliance in a medical context for long enough that she does not alter her register, regardless of who is on the other end of the call, and Clara had said that she was a medical professional and that she understood the implications of a genetic disclosure of this nature, and that she needed to understand what protections existed for the registered profile holders, and Dr. Anita Ferreira had said that she understood Clara's concerns, and that the appropriate place to discuss them was the in-person compliance meeting the following morning. And then she had said the thing that Clara had not been prepared for, and the doctor's reveal had been delivered in the same even register that Dr. Anita Ferreira used for everything, which was that the case file had already been flagged for institutional review, and that any failure to attend the scheduled compliance meeting would result in the immediate transmission of the institutional review flag to the Medical Licensing Board as a standard regulatory notification, and Clara had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said that they would be there. I looked at the digital booking confirmation screen on the reception desk below 3 arrival slots. 9:15, 9:15, 9:30. I looked at the confirmation and I thought about a Tuesday morning in February and a file with a standard priority flag. And I thought about 8 years of being told that I worked in a waiting room. And I thought about what a waiting room actually is, which is a place where people sit before they are called in. And I looked at the 3 arrival slots on the screen, and I thought that tomorrow morning the waiting room was going to be very full. I turned back to my desk. I opened my queue. I began to work. I arrived at the headquarters building at 7:30 on Tuesday morning, which was 90 minutes before the first arrival slot. And I want to tell you about the specific reason for arriving 90 minutes early, which was not anxiety and was not the need to prepare in the dramatic sense of that word, and was the same reason I arrive early for everything, which is that a person who controls the environment before the other parties arrive is a person who has already made one decision that the other parties have not, and that asymmetry is small and it is enough. The chief director's office on the top floor had been made available to me for the compliance meeting through an arrangement with Dr. Anita Ferreira and the laboratory group's executive committee. And I want to describe the office because I think the description matters, which is that it is a large room with a glass frontage on 2 sides and a desk that is positioned so that the person behind it has the light behind them and the person across from it has the light in front of them. And there is a chair behind the desk that is high-backed and leather and that faces the door. And I sat in it at 7:35 and I looked at the door and I thought about a Sunday evening when I was 12 years old and a man looking at my mother across a table for half a second too long. And I thought about 8 years of being told that I worked in a waiting room. And I thought about what I was sitting in, which was not a waiting room. I opened the compliance folder on the desk. I read through it once from the beginning. Not because I needed to, and because reading a document before you present it is a form of respect for the document, and the document deserved respect because it was accurate, and accuracy deserved respect. And I closed the folder and I placed it in the center of the desk, and I turned the chair so that it faced the glass wall behind the desk, and I looked at the city, which was doing what it did on Tuesday mornings. And I waited. My assistant knocked at 9:12. She said that the first 2 parties had arrived, and I said that she could bring them up in 3 minutes, and I heard her heels on the floor outside. And then I heard the lift, and then I heard the particular quality of a corridor when it contains people who are walking toward something they have been compelled to walk toward and have not chosen. And at 9:16 the door opened. My mother came in first. She had dressed for a confrontation, which is to say she had dressed in the way she dressed for occasions that required her to communicate authority. And what she communicated instead in that room at that moment was the specific anxiety of a person wearing the clothes of a version of herself that the morning had already made unavailable, and her eyes went to the desk, and then to the chair which was facing away from her, and she moved further into the room, and my father came in behind her. And I want to tell you about my father's quality that morning because it was different from every quality I had observed in him before. And what it was hollowness. And I mean that in the precise sense, which is that the particular density that my father had always carried, which was the density of a man who believed his presence filled a room appropriately, had been replaced by something lighter and less substantial. And he moved into the room with the careful movements of a person who is no longer certain how much space they are entitled to occupy. Clara came in. Last, she was holding a folder, and the folder contained her medical student credentials and her university correspondence. And I understood the folder immediately because I understood Clara, which is to say I understood that Clara responds to institutional threat by producing documentation of her legitimacy. And the documentation was real, and the credentials were genuine, and the folder was not going to be relevant to what happened in this room. And I noted that, and I said nothing. My mother said that she wanted to speak to whoever was in charge. I turned the chair. I want to tell you about the silence that followed the turning of the chair. And I want to tell you about it carefully, because I think it was one of the most complete silences I have ever been present in. And what made it complete was that it was not produced by the absence of sound, and was produced by the presence of an understanding arriving simultaneously in three people. And the understanding was the same in all three of them, which was that the person in the chair was me, and the person in the chair was the chief senior director of the compliance review. And the person in the chair was the dead-end lab worker they had been describing to their social circle for 8 years. And the three understandings arrived at the same moment, and the silence they produced had a physical quality to it that I could feel from the other side of the desk. My mother's mouth opened. She said that this was not fair. She said it twice, and then she said that family did not do this to family, and that I had manipulated the situation, and that I had used my position to arrange something that was designed to humiliate them. And her voice was climbing in the way that her voice climbed when the management of a room was escaping her, and the words were coming faster, and I sat in the chair and I looked at her, and I did not change my expression, and I did not raise my hand for silence, and I simply waited, and the glass walls of the office did what glass walls do, which is reflect sound back into the space that produced it. And my mother's voice bounced off those walls and came back to her, and she heard it. The way you hear yourself when the room gives your words back to you without the softening that carpets and curtains provide. And after a moment, the climbing stopped. I opened the compliance folder. I said that I wanted to read them the relevant section of the verified findings, and I read it in the register I use for all professional presentations, which is level and specific and without emphasis beyond what the content itself requires. And I read the confidence rating, and I read the data chain confirmation, and I read the plain language summary that the laboratory produces for all verified mismatch disclosures. And I read my sister's name in the document. And I read R's name in the document. And I looked at Clara when I read R's name, and Clara looked at the folder and did not look at my mother. I said that the institutional rules required me to tell them that a verified mismatch result of this category, combined with the registration of a profile under an incorrect biological parentage, constituted a fraudulent profile entry in the laboratory's national database, and that fraudulent profile entries triggered an automatic referral to the Medical Licensing Board for any registered holder who held or was applying for a medical professional license. I looked at Clara's folder. I said that the referral had not yet been transmitted. I said that the transmission was scheduled and that the schedule was a function of the institutional process and not of my personal discretion. And I said this because it was true and because I needed them to understand that what was happening in this room was not revenge and was not personal and was the institutional process doing what the institutional process was built to do, which was tell the truth regardless of who needed it. Not to Clara said my name. It was the first word she had said since entering the room. I looked at her. I said that all questions regarding the compliance timeline and the referral process should be directed to Dr. Anita Ferreira, whose contact details were on the last page of the folder, and that Dr. Ferreira would be available to discuss the formal process with them after this meeting. My mother put her hand on the desk. My father looked at the window. Clara looked at the folder in her own hands, and then she looked at me, and I looked back at her, and I thought about a piano and a car and a Christmas dinner and a soft spot that had lasted 18 years. And I thought about what it feels like to discover that the identity you have been given was built on something that was never disclosed to you. And I thought that of the three people standing in front of my desk, Clara was the one who deserved the most accurate account of my thinking, which was that the referral to the licensing board was institutional and not personal, and that the institution did not ask me what I preferred, and I had already told them that the laboratory did not produce preferential outcomes. They stood in front of my desk. The city was visible through the glass behind me. The folder was open between us, and the silence in the room was the silence of three people understanding that the invisible daughter they had made invisible for 26 years was the only person in the building with the authority to determine what happened next, and that the determining was going to be done the same way everything else in this room had been done, which was precisely and without preference and in complete and total silence. 6 months is the amount of time it takes for an institutional process to complete itself when the process has been initiated correctly and has not been interfered with. And I want to tell you about those 6 months in the way I have told you about everything else in this account, which is accurately and without embellishment. And the accurate description is that they were 6 months of work, and the work was the same work it had always been, which is precise and methodical and absorbing in the way that work absorbs you when you have chosen it entirely for yourself, and it is enough. And it was enough. And I went to my desk every morning and I processed what was in front of me. And I did not direct the institutional process, and I did not accelerate it, and I did not slow it, and I let it move at the speed it was built to move at, which is the speed of an institution that does not have feelings about its outcomes and does not have preferences and does not ask who needs what result and simply produces what the evidence requires. The fraud report was transmitted to the National Medical Licensing Board in the 4th week after the compliance meeting. The transmission was automatic and was triggered by the completion of the institutional review process, which had taken 3 weeks and had been conducted by a team that did not include me, and whose findings I received as a notification in my case file management system the same way I received all notifications, which is as an item in a queue that I processed in order. And I opened the notification, and I read it, and I logged the confirmation, and I moved to the next item in the queue. I want to tell you what the licensing board's process produced because I think it is important to describe it plainly. And the plain description is this, which was that Clara's student registration was suspended pending investigation within 10 days of the fraud report's transmission, and the investigation had access to the full verified data chain from the laboratory's case file, and the investigation completed in 6 weeks. And the finding was that the registration of a genetic profile under an incorrect biological parentage in a national medical database constituted a category of ethical violation that was incompatible with continued registration as a medical professional, and that the incompatibility was not addressable through remediation, and the registration was permanently revoked. I received the licensing board's decision as a document forwarded to the compliance case file. I read it once. I filed it. I thought about Clara standing in my office holding a folder of credentials that she had believed were her identity. And I thought about what it means to have an identity removed, not by a person, and not by a confrontation, and by the institution itself, through its own process, using its own language. And I sat with that thought for a moment, and then I went back to my queue. R had engaged his own legal team within 48 hours of the compliance meeting. And I knew this because the legal team had contacted the laboratory group's external legal counsel to explore the scope of the disclosure. And what the laboratory's external legal counsel had communicated back was that the disclosure had been made through the standard institutional process and was fully compliant with all applicable regulatory frameworks, and that there was no legal basis for challenging a verified tertiary-level genetic disclosure result. And R's legal team had received that communication and had then turned their attention inward, which is to say they had turned their attention toward managing what the disclosure meant for R's own position. And R's own position was the position of a man whose profile in the National Genetic Database now contained a verified biological match to a child he had not publicly acknowledged, and whose health screening records were part of a case file that had been reviewed at the institutional level. And the audit that followed the review was conducted by the laboratory group's internal compliance team, and it examined the scope of R's previous interactions with the laboratory group's services. And the audit found what audits find when they are conducted thoroughly, which is the complete picture. And the complete picture of R's relationship with the laboratory group services included elements that his legal team spent the following 3 months managing at considerable expense. And the management was not entirely successful. And the social and financial consequences of the incomplete management were of the kind that R had spent 30 years arranging his life to avoid, and he had not arranged it carefully enough as it turned out. And what he had arranged instead was 30 years of a Sunday dinner table, and a piano, and a car, and a soft spot, and a genetics database that had been running its verification protocols quietly in a building he had never visited. My mother stopped calling after the 2nd month. My father sent a message to the laboratory's patient communication portal in the 5th month. The message was addressed to me by name, and it said that he wanted to speak privately, and that he was not well, and that he was asking as a father, and that whatever had happened between us, he hoped I could find a way to meet him as family, and he used the word family. And I want to tell you that I read the message with the same quality of attention I gave every item in my queue, and that I instructed my assistant to send the standard automated response, which stated that all communications regarding closed case files were required to go through the standard patient communication portal, and that response times were 5 to 7 working days, and that the laboratory group appreciated his understanding. My assistant sent it within the hour. I went back to my work. I want to tell you about the thing I understand now that I did not understand when I was sitting at a table at 12 years old, watching my mother look at R for half a second too long. And what I understand now is this, which is that the people who push you to the back of every room are always making a calculation. And the calculation is that the back of the room is where things go to become invisible. And what they do not calculate is that the back of the room is also where you learn to read the entire room without being seen reading it. And I read that room for 8 years. And I read it with the quality of attention that my work had taught me, which is precise and complete, and without the distortion that comes from wanting the result to be something other than what it is. I stood at the window of the executive floor on a gray morning in October. The city was doing what cities do in October, which is moving inside a gray that is patient and indifferent. And the laboratory group's building was reflected in the glass of the building opposite, and I could see the reflection of my own floor. And I thought about a dead-end job. And I thought about a waiting room. And I thought about what a waiting room actually produces when the person sitting in it is paying attention, which is complete and comprehensive knowledge of everything that happens in the room, while the person who dismissed them as waiting believes the waiting is all there is. Silence was never my weakness. I want to say that as the final thing, because I believe it is the most important thing. And silence was never emptiness, and was never the absence of something, and was the condition under which I could hear everything, and see everything, and build everything, and the people who interpreted my silence as the silence of someone who had nothing to say were always the people who had the most to lose from being wrong about that. And they were wrong, and the institution had said so, and the institution does not have preferences and does not produce outcomes on the basis of need, and simply tells the truth at the tertiary verification level. And the truth had been in the queue on a Tuesday morning in February, waiting to be opened by the person who had been trained to read it. And that person had been sitting at a desk in a building. Her parents called a dead end for 8 years, and the dead end had turned out to be a door. And I had always known how to open doors. If you believe that justice was served in absolute silence, then leave a comment below and tell me which part of this story stayed with you the longest, because I read every single one. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, being told that your work is small, or your ambition is limited, or your place is at the back, I want you to understand that the back of the room has the most complete view of everything happening at the front, and the front does not know it is being watched. And if this story gave you something today, takes 2 seconds and helps this reach the person who is currently in their own 8 years of being underestimated and needs to know that the queue always comes around. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do it now, because every story on this channel is built on the same understanding, which is that silence kept with precision is not the absence of power, and is power in its most patient and most complete form. And I will see you in the next story.